Welcome back, Bannock folks. You're watching another episode of Bannockdotes, the podcast that holds it down for the underground sound here in Ontario, Canada. And I'm your host, Phil Paxton. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Helps me out a bunch. I'm almost at 100 subscribers. I can almost taste it. And if you aren't already, follow the Instagram page. That's at Bannockdotes. That's where we do all our updates, post all our clips. Tell me what you like about the show. You can leave a comment down below on our YouTube channel. Tell me if you like it, if you hate it, if you got any questions you want me to ask any of the guests, if you have any ideas for guests you want me to have in the future, leave it all down below. And of course, give it a like. That helps me a bunch. Now, I asked you folks what shows were happening in Ontario in the next month or so, and you guys came at me with a ton of shows. So I'm going to go and list off all these rad shows. Yeah, hold on to your butts. Here we go. Friday, March 18th in Sudbury, we got Maxim Shock with Light Mirrors, The Therapist, and For Mother, and that's at Ziggs. In Hamilton, we got Back to the 80s with Moonlight Desires, and they're a band featuring members of Sons of Butchers, and that's happening at the Absinthe. In Waterloo, at Maxwell's, they're having a metal night featuring Stolos, Tough Guy, North Shroud, and Talbotville Gore. Saturday, March 19th, in Hamilton, they're doing No Passage Fest. It's going to be a good time. That's at the Bridge Works, featuring Like Pacific, A Will Away, Exalt, Force Green, Falsifier, Nightwell, Judgment, Downswing, Fight Club, Hazel, Napoleon, and Gavel. That's going to be a good time. Make sure you grab your tickets for that. Friday, March 25th in St. Catharines, Bannockdotes and Indoor Shoes presents Crywink. They're a band coming from the UK. They're playing with The Commuted, Drifter, Redcoat, and my homie John Lepp. In Toronto that night at Sneaky D's, we have Send the Ravens with Matria, Cinodo, and Seagrave. And then in Etobicoke at the Rock Pile, we got Jaegernaut, Sequential Fear, Tremors, Old Time Moonshine, and of course Dawn Valley. That's going to be a good time. Saturday, March 26th at the Doors in Hamilton, we got Snakes, Twin Banshee, Tort, and Flesh Guzzler. Cold Shoulder are doing a run of shows. March 31st, they're going to be in London at Rum Runners. April 1st, they're going to be in Toronto at Hard Luck. April 2nd in Ottawa at the Dominion Tavern. April 3rd in Hamilton at the Absinthe. And they're doing those shows with Flashback. That's going to be a great time. Trench Lung and Gouge Out are also doing a bunch of shows. Just a weekend of stuff. April 1st as well. They're going to be in Ajax at Roticulus, or Roddy. You know how it is. April 2nd, they're going to be in Guelph at Jimmy Jazz. April 3rd, they're going to end it in Windsor at the Backstage. I haven't been to the Backstage in Windsor. I wonder what that's like. April 1st in Hamilton at the Casbah, we got B.A. Johnson with Sons of Butchers and Thundercock. April 2nd in Hamilton at the Absinthe, we got Penske File, and Sweet and Lowdown, and OK Swimmer. Teeth are doing a run of shows. April 6th, Hamilton at the Doors. April 7th in Toronto at Sneaky D's. April 8th in Ottawa at the Dominion Tavern. April 9th, Montreal at Le Foufou Electrique. And April 11th, they're ending it in London at Run Runners. Saturday, April 9th in Ottawa at the Mavericks, we got Scorching Tomb, Cruel Fate, Gland, and Leprosy. Friday, April 15th in Toronto, we got Hard Luck, or at the Hard Luck, sorry. We got Loose Teeth with their Wormwood release with Rust, Still Numb, and Strange Limbs. Saturday, April 16th in Hamilton at the Doors, we get the Gavel EP release presented by Off Leash in Heaven. That's featuring Gavel, of course. Mile End, Die Alone, and Still Numb. Oh my God, so many shows happening in Ontario. So if you're in those areas, make sure you go out because, the stuff is kind of rolling out and we're excited to be back. Speaking of shows, I think this is a great way to introduce my guest this week. We're speaking with Erik Dickson, and he runs warehouse in here in St. Catharines. He does indoor shoes and Trust Beer Bar. He is an entrepreneur. He's been working hard with bands. Him and I are friends, obviously through bands, and we had a great time talking. And you know what? Let's just get into it. Cool. Right on. Well, thank you for tuning in to Banecdotes. Thank you for joining us. My t-shirt of this week is Trauma Model. They're our homies from Kingston. If you haven't heard of them, go check them out. And my guest this week is Erik Dickson of what? Here we go. Indoor Shoes, Warehouse, Trust Bar. What else you got?
Oh, that's a good list.
You're not into crypto?
No, I have zero crypto.
Good.
Actually, I have maybe a little bit of.
You don't know?
I have like.
Can you talk more into the mic?
Yeah. Sorry.
I have like $70 worth of Bitcoin I bought like 8 years ago.
How much Bitcoin is that?
No, that was the dollar amount. That's the current dollar value.
Okay.
It was like, I don't know how much it was then. I think I switched a $20 bill in on some sketchy random machine in Toronto like
I've
7
seen
years
before.
ago, and like I was like, sure, I'll lose $20. And then I remembered that I had it like a few months ago, and I freaked out. I was like, can I get into this account and maybe I have a bunch of money? And then it was like $70 Canadian. So I think I probably spent it. I probably spent the Bitcoin on like coffee or something back then when you could do that. So anyway, no crypto. Those other things. Other way less interesting things, I guess, than crypto.
Yeah. Now, how's been Warehouse with all the shit going on? How with the on and off again concerts? How is that?
I mean, more or less, there's been little to no activity since March 2020. So we did our last show on the 14th or 13th of March, and then we followed sort of like the trends of sort of what was allowed and what wasn't, and generally like nothing in that context has been allowed away from like a few months throughout the last like year and a half. So we did a set of like seated shows, like very low key, in December of 2020 when you could do like seated only, and we kind of played with like a model where people would sit at tables and you sort of paid for a table rather than a ticket. And that was only like 6 or 7 shows, and then nothing again until basically October of last year. We kind of got back to like 100% capacity for like about 3 months, and did as much as we could do during that time. But otherwise, we've tried, mostly it's been dark in there, just like use the space for rehearsals or music video shoots and stuff that bands could do that wasn't actually a show, but still utilize the space in some way. So none of that stuff was really big financially. It was just something to keep the room sort of useful.
And then you've been doing Trust as well.
Yeah, which a lot of people assumed that it was like a response to not being able to do Warehouse, but that place was sort of in the works for about a year before it opened, I guess, or maybe even longer. I guess in a sense, like the timing was good because I got a chance to really focus on something else during what otherwise would have been like a time I would have lost my mind, like not having anything to do. So that place is like more of a full-time bar restaurant that's open, has been open and has gone through sort of the same waves of like restrictions and closed and open, but has fared reasonably well, considering a lot of restaurants have had a really super hard time, keeping above water the whole time.
So so you've come a long way from being like the venue owner. I mean, even another business owner, from being a promoter all the way back. You've been doing it for years now.
Yeah, sort of. It seems crazy to think that I was saying to someone yesterday that like a little over 10 years, almost 11 years, which is crazy because it definitely wasn't the plan. Not that there was much of one, but it wasn't like I had a specific plan to go from putting on shows or being involved with shows to like running a venue. Yeah, so it's been a crazy ride.
And so how did you get started? How did it, because you're not from St. Catharines, are you?
No, I grew up in Tillsonburg, which is like a little bit south of London. And came to St. Catharines to go to Brock. Ironically, I think one of the main reasons I chose Brock and St. Catharines as a place to go to school was because of the music scene in St. Catharines when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Scene Fest sort of peaked, had its sort of like peak years, like in terms of, you know, interest level, like for me when I was in like grade 11, 12, and then sort of moved here for a lot of what was going on. And ironically, you know, some of the major drivers of that scene back then like left sort of around the same time, being like Dine Alone or at least Bedlam Society, you know, Joel Carrier sort of took that leap to Toronto and sort of at the same time that I moved here. Now, I mean, like back in 2006, like I was basically just a student at Brock and wasn't involved in anything. It was just like I went to shows occasionally at like L3 or there's a couple other places back then, but I certainly wasn't like involved or had any real interest in getting involved. It wasn't even like on my mind. Like I was just in school. When I had a couple of classes with people who were like in the scene, I guess. One of them was Timmer.
Is that how you met him?
I wouldn't say officially met because we didn't exchange any words at all, but the first interaction I had with Timmer was a first year film class where he was at the wrong seminar room. Like he was at the wrong seminar. So he was like in this room with like 13 people or whatever. And the person running the class like took attendance and he was like, I'm actually in the wrong class, and just got up and left like 5 minutes in. And we laughed because that was a funny thing to have happened.
Yeah.
And we ended up having other classes together in that first year. My like focus in university shifted after that, but we kind of knew each other through, you know, that first year and then like seeing each other at stuff. But we kind of got involved. I got involved in like what he was already doing in about the halfway point of like 2011, where it was already shows at the Mansion House in the sort of the 73 era had just sort of wrapped up. And
Was Indoor Shoes already created? Or
yeah, I mean, him and Shane had created Indoor Shoes just at the end of 2010.
Okay.
And they were doing shows more or less exclusively at Mansion House, which was like at the time was he had gotten a job as like an entertainment person, like an entertainment booker, I guess, for the bar.
Yeah.
That handled like the cover bands, but also like other stuff if he could do it. And so he kind of just took what he was doing at 73, I guess, and like whatever could fit at another place that was more of a bar, he would do. So I got involved. He like asked me to design some like flyers for shows, and we kind of interacted that way for like 4 or 5 months, and then I guess I just started coming to the shows and like helping out here and there because I found it interesting, and then that just really organically just built into like him and I kind of like collaborating more on what that looked like, and eventually kind of like turning it into a more of a business than it was obviously at the time. Like back then it was like his job, but it was the whole Indoor Shoes thing was definitely more of a hobby that he sort of took on, and then there was like I think there was an opportunity to sort of turn it more into a business, which is where where it went the few years after. So at the beginning it was like very local, occasional touring band shows at a bar that didn't necessarily want them there. and then on the side like a independent like record label project that, you know, attempted to release like mostly again local bands music and try to drive like more of an audience for those bands. So that was the sort of two-pronged thing. It was more or less like do shows, whatever money you make on those shows, like dump that into like putting out music for bands. And that sort of formula continued until basically Timmer moved to Toronto for his first like sort of real music industry job.
That's wild. You've been doing it for a long time. And then so is Indoor Shoes like a thing still? Is it just a brand?
Yeah, I guess it's more like a brand or like a marketing tool, like on the internet. I mean, like it still exists as it has pages on the internet, but what Indoor Shoes was always just sort of like a figurative business, right? Or like a figment. It wasn't like a real concrete thing. It didn't have a location, it didn't have an office. It was just like a name brand, I guess.
Yeah.
And it definitely still existed after Warehouse opened, which happened in 2017, but it again kind of took the role of like the the original music like show marketing tool, right? So it had a following on the internet, and those people that followed it, whatever ones were still looking at it, were like expecting to see that this is where the shows would be promoted that were touring bands and local bands. And so I sort of treated it as like, well, we have Warehouse as the venue, but it's got to talk about all the stuff going on. It's got to talk about the flea markets, the tribute shows, the like the dance parties, the DJ nights, like all the shows other people do, right? In addition to the shows that we book. So that was sort of how they separated. But yeah, 5 years, almost 5 years, like coming up on 5 years since Warehouse opened. Obviously, only real 3 of those being active, but yeah, and then the other, 6 years of indoor shoes. So it's been a weird path, especially considering it wasn't something I was planning on really. It wasn't something I was anticipating doing on a full-time level. It came out of like Timmer moved to Toronto, which like really was like the point of what we were doing at the time. Like we were doing shows. It was not really either of our jobs. It was like something that was like fun. It was fun to do. And Timmer's goal was always to sort of work in the music industry on a more like real full-time way.
Yep.
And so we were kind of just doing it. And I think for a while it felt like we were just doing that to get him to that point. And then I had no real plan. I was like I had jobs in like marketing and stuff that I was doing. So it more or less felt like we were trying to get him to a point where he had a full-time music industry job. And then when that happened, and he moved to Toronto, I sort of ended up in this position where it was like, do I keep doing this without him or do I stop? And, I had to like, that was around the time, like we were at Detour for shows, which was also a terrible room for concerts for the most part. I mean, some cool shows happened there, but it was not an ideal space. Especially considering, the real concert venue that exists now, like that's actually built for it. But I was at this point where that place was like coming apart, both literally and sort of figuratively. Like the ownership was not interested. He was trying to sell the place. The gear was crumbling. Like it was a mess. And I had to sort of make a decision, which was either to continue doing shows and figure out a new venue opportunity or option, or just walk away from it. And it was obviously like, it was a weird time in my life because I was around the same time also considered like maybe moving on from St. Catharines and like going and doing something else. By then I had been here for like almost 10 years. And anyway, I mean, the biggest factor was like walking away from the music scene, really. I mean, the weirdest thing at that time was that anyone else who had sort of been doing, organizing shows or promoting shows in any sort of real way had already moved on as well.
Yep.
So it was sort of us doing it, and everything else was very DIY, like basement shows, whatever. Bar bands, not the same thing. There was very little like independent music promotion happening. So if I was to stop doing that, it would have like left what I thought was like, it was just going to leave all these bands, all these people in sort of like a state where they had no either outlet to play a show or go see a show, unless it was one at the Performing Arts Center or the Arena, or like to go to Hamilton or go to Buffalo or go to Toronto to see a show. And so it sort of created the path towards like actually opening a real venue in the city, which is it was crazy as a concept back then. It seemed like it. I guess I don't think I really considered how like crazy that would be to do. Like it's not the most lucrative business in the world. Like there's lots of other things someone could do that make more money than a concert venue. So and how challenging it would be. But that was also pre-COVID and pre me ever running a business like that before, so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into.
Right. Yeah, you've come a long way. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Are there plans for the year now that things are like opening up? Like, is there any Cicada? Is there anything going on with that, or?
Yeah, so that's coming back in October for the third time.
And that's like your festival.
It's like I'm part of a group. Like it's a group of 5 people that I'm sort of like the music industry person within it, I suppose. Okay. Like the rest of the group prior to that had little to no like sort of event experience. The connection was the family, the sons of the the guy who had originally started this like Cicada Fest idea like over a decade ago, and like his as like a backyard barbecue party thing for the community. It was his sons who sort of decided to carry that idea on after he passed away, and that I got involved because they wanted to do like a music event. And so there's 5 of us. I mean, it's more or less like that's the organized group, I guess. It's not my thing singularly by any means.
Okay.
Yeah, I just sort of, I book it and do most of the organizing in a way because I have that experience, but it's definitely a shared thing.
And that's getting bigger and bigger every year, right?
Yeah, so this year, like we would have been at 5 years this year, but that's again 2 years off. So this is the 3rd one. I mean, in the first 2, it grew like decent in terms of population or attendance. So hopefully, like again, I mean, it'd be crazy. The capacity of that space in Port Dalhousie is like, it's hard to determine. I think it's like we could probably do like 4,000 or 5,000 people in that space.
Yeah.
So in the first year, it was like a little over. It was like 1,500, and then last time it was about just over 2,200 or 2,300 people. So it could grow. Hopefully, it grows past the 3,000 person mark this year. But yeah, it's growing. I mean, it's not. The nice thing about having a capacity at that space is that it's limited in terms of like it can never get too big.
Yeah.
Like Scene Fest got to a point where it was like 6, I think, at its like when it was still just a multi-venue like downtown festival without the park. It was like I think that 6,000 in the 6,000 range was like where they were at their biggest, like in terms of attendance, which is like a crazy amount of people when you think about where how many venues, like how many people those venues could hold, and like the outdoor spaces weren't massive, like so. But it also could keep going, right? It evolved to the point where it was like Montebello Park, where it's like 10,000 people could fit there. So it had this like, could have kept going and gotten bigger and bigger.
Do you see Cicada growing to get to that big point? Or would you want it to get to that point? Or
I think the attitude of the group that's organizing this thing is like that there's a ceiling to what it should be.
Okay.
I have this thought about music festivals that like when they get really, really big, they're like really difficult to book, not just because you're dealing with like the biggest and most expensive artists to bring in, but that they're, when you put on the largest festival, if you think about Way Home, for example, like Way Home happened 3 times, and the first couple of years, like the lineups were crazy. Like it was like the biggest bands, some of the biggest bands or artists in the world. And then in the 3rd year, like they were also still some of the biggest bands in the world, but they had a hard time like convincing everyone that it was as good as the first couple of years.
Sure.
And like when you get into that point, there's like a threshold where you hit that level where it's like the biggest artists that you can get, and then what do you do next year? Like how do you? So I mean, to put it simply, like the goal is to try to keep it where like every year it feels like it's getting better, even if it's not necessarily growing at some like exponential rate. Because I don't think you want to get to a point where someone goes like, well, last year was better.
Right.
And that'll happen a lot faster if you're going straight to like the biggest artists in the country.
That makes sense.
So, and it's like a little bit more niche in terms of like genre. Like it's not as broad. It's more like indie folk.
What's like the heaviest band on there?
The heaviest band, probably like, I mean, that's a funny question. Probably like, I mean, like Winter Sleep.
Yeah.
It's like not a heavy band. I mean, Basement Revolver is like a sort of a shoegazy kind of band from Hamilton.
Yeah.
I hate classifications like that, but I read it literally today. I read that in a headline about them, so I could say that. But like they're more of a rock band, like the Mandevilles played last time. They're like a rock band, but it's certainly not in the realm of a scene fest where you're talking about like alternative styles. This is more like in the stream of like Canadian indie folk roots. Like it still has like it's still pretty broad. Like a lot of different bands can play it, but it's sort of downstream. That's like more general appeal. Like almost any of those bands you could hear on like Indie 88 or The Edge or something like that. So it could grow pretty big, but it's not going to be like, the hope is to try to keep it more local, more community driven. Like there are some festivals in Ontario that have been going on for a decade and they've never gotten super big.
Right.
And that's, I think, part of the reason that those things are sustainable is because they that they are sort of smaller.
Yeah.
Supercrawl is like 100,000 people, I think, now on it's free. It's like a big thing in Hamilton, but it can be like, I think it's that number of people. I mean, I've been a couple times, so I don't know exactly, but that thing is also like the biggest bands. And I think that's the challenge with trying to do something that isn't our full-time job, that can actually happen like into the future, that it doesn't get too big. So, yeah. And then like that is sort of a big project on the side of everything else, like on top of the venue. And but yeah, I think I like got to a point where there was like an interest in doing other events that were sort of had music as a component, but weren't necessarily like a music driven event. I mean, Cicada is a music festival, but we're also putting on a beer festival in the summer that has a music component, but isn't just a music festival.
Right.
And those sort of things got kind of interesting to me as I got, once the venue had, again, not at the moment, but once the venue was sort of rolling, it felt like, okay, like this is working. Maybe there's some other events that can be, that people in Niagara want to go to that aren't just concerts inside of a venue.
Right. Do you play any music yourself?
Not since basically high school.
What did you play?
I guess I played everything. I mean, I think I started playing drums.
Yeah.
I was like in music class in high school as like in the, like you got to, I don't know how it is here. Like my high school was really small and everybody wanted to play drums or bass.
Yeah.
And you had to like basically do a lottery to choose who got to play what. And it was like your first choice, your second choice. So like instead of playing saxophone, I played drums because like that was I won the lottery in that, grade 10 music class. So I played drums like in music class in high school. And then that obviously like, and I was, the people I was friends with, it lent to playing other instruments. So, but again, nothing in a band that was ever outside of like some high school talent show. Everything was just, and I think when I went away for school, it was sort of like the end of like retired the idea of even just like music as a hobby.
Yeah.
Which again is even weirder that I ended up doing what I'm doing. But I always say that like I'd realized that I was better off in the background, but still involved in like the making of sometimes. I mean, or the facilitating music, even if it's not me doing it.
Right on.
Yeah.
Right on. All right. Well, I think we could get into some anecdotes. Now, I know you're not in a band yourself, but you work with plenty of bands, and we're not here to, smear any bands to the mud. So if you want to, if you have a story about a band and you don't want to tell, mention their name, you can call them the Wiggles or Beyonce. Or something.
Beyonce.
Yeah.
Also not a band. Has a band. Isn't a band. In 10 years of doing shows at various scales, there's obviously like all kinds of moments that are memorable and stories. And as I said to you before, it's like hard to think of, like there's plenty of like really great stories and things that are, make doing what I do now seem easier than it did, 10 years ago or even less. Bands that have been like super genuine and friendly and accepting of the fact that like here's a group of people that haven't done this for very long and are used to dealing with maybe promoters and venues that do. So should just say that there's a fair share of stories that are like that really reinforce why doing this thing isn't or why you keep doing it, even though it's not like a huge money thing. And obviously like the opportunities to work with local bands over the years sort of as well. It's not just about the bands that come in from out of town that you don't know personally that are like big and you're sort of like freaked out by the idea of dealing with them. It's also like working with bands that in the area and seeing them accomplish cool stuff. Mm-hmm. And sort of I guess like on that, there's a lot of local bands we've worked with, both in terms of putting on shows, but also like helping them sort of put out music. Mm-hmm. And even if it wasn't like a project that we were like specifically involved in, like we definitely had like an Indoor Shoes catalog of like releases on a sort of label level. Mm-hmm. But like away from that, there was tons of bands that we dealt with where we were trying to help them do that, even if it wasn't with us, right? It was like, okay, if you guys want to put out a CD, like here's what has to happen. We're going to help you through the process. And there's a number of bands that Timmer and I, over the years, like guided through that process because we did it so many times.
Yeah.
And
it was like clockwork.
Yeah, it was like, here's all the people you call and the people that you email to get this stuff done. And then, you'll have this many CDs. In order to pay for that many CDs, you need this much money. And our way of helping you achieve that was like, let's do a show, and here's how you get there, right? You need to make $1,000. Here's how many people have to be at that show, and how much we can, help you make. I feel like we've done that. I feel like we've done that with Sinner.
I'm sure we have.
Yeah, it's like, you guys are doing a release show. How do we make that? How do we make enough money?
Yeah.
One that comes to mind is like Bitter Kids, who you talked to Keegan. That their previous band, they did one of their last big shows at L3, and it was like this sort of, those guys grew up here, and I mean, I'd been here long enough to realize like sort of the history and the significance that a lot of people in the music scene place on L3 as like a venue you could play, because it had that history of like, coming up through the 2000s of like, this is where Alexisonfire played. This is where, there's a long list of like big Canadian and American artists that have played there, and the idea of headlining L3 came with a certain amount of like cachet to people in the region. So
absolutely,
when Bitter Kids, as an example, when they were like sort of wrapping up as a band, they wanted to do like one last big show, and they had that feeling about L3 because they had been to those shows, right? They had been to the We Came as Romans and the
Bring Me the Horizon
shows, and like what that sort of meant to say we headlined at L3 was a big deal. So we booked that, we booked the venue, we helped them, choose the bands that played. We like gave them like, here's how it's going to work. Like, you can, if the show hits this number of people, this is how much money you're going to make. And like, they were trying to sort of like retire the band and like resolve sort of like some of the debts associated with like buying a trailer and printing a ton of merch and CDs and all this stuff. And so they were trying to finish the project, I guess, walk away from it without any money like owed. And anyway, the point is that they hustled. They, obviously that idea of playing that place was important. Like that last show kind of being one of those examples of a headline at L3. And beyond that, being able to say like sold out L3 was like that was like their ultimate goal. And I remember thinking like, that's going to be really difficult because it's like 380
it's a huge
tickets. It's a lot for a band like from the area that technically isn't even really, I mean, they were a band still at that point, but they were intending to not be. So, anyway, the point is that like they got to that point, they sold out the show. And I remember it happening, a certain amount of tickets sold in advance, and then the show was happening, and I was keeping tabs on like where we were at. I remember there was probably like 30 or 40 tickets left when the show started. And they were literally like, the stairwell behind the stage at L3, and you come in from the back door, and it's like a set of stairs, but that leads you up to the stage. And most bands that would play there, like headliner bands, would like come up from the back.
They're like walk on.
It's like the walk on opportunity that you don't necessarily get everywhere. And the band was literally like in that little hallway area with like guitars on, like just about to go on. Like they were in that like 10-minute transition period where the stage was already set, but they hadn't gone on yet. And the show had actually sold out. It got to that point. And so I was able to like kind of rush through. I remember finding out it was like Tasha, probably, or Michelle working at the front door saying like, hey, we're done. Like, we have no more tickets. And me being like, I need to tell these guys before they go on stage. And sort of like rushing through the like main floor and the downstairs of L3, which was rammed full of people because of course it was like, that 10 minutes before the headliner goes on and everyone's like getting a drink or whatever. And getting to them and being like, guys, the show's sold out. Like, you did it. And like, it sounds funny that that's like such a big deal because, lots of shows sell out.
Right.
But when you've grown up in this music scene as like, and they're like kids, like when they started that band, they were teenagers. Before that, they were in other bands. And like, like Bitter Kids did things like they played like the Warped Tour or Toronto date.
That's right.
Like they won a contest or they got voted in to like play and like they toured Ontario. They did a couple of other like runs. They recorded in the States with like somebody in a band, like they did the real band thing. They were trying to do it, and they were trying to do it in the same way that like the bands that they liked from here and from Ontario before had done it, where it was like start small, like build a fan base, like, all that stuff. And so to go to them on their last show and say like, hey, you did it, and then have them go on stage like knowing that was a sold out crowd like was very, very cool.
Yeah.
I mean, and you know, there's been so much history in this area with bands. There's so many bands. There's so many people. It's like hard to pick
Yeah.
a story that's like represents anything. But you know, one of the things about doing this job, I guess, is that you know you deal with hundreds of people and you do hundreds of shows, and a lot of the time, the pandemic and not doing them has been a great like reminder of this. But you know, every once in a while, you're reminded like why you're doing it. There's like a reality is that when you do 150 shows a year, it's really hard to get excited at every single one of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes you're just in the motion of like bands on stage, you know, settling the show, starting the show, like all those steps. And every once in a while, it's nice to get like a reminder of like why it actually is super fun. And you know, I always say it's like I like facilitate people having fun or good times. You know, like sometimes it's the crowd and sometimes it's the band, but like you know, you get a situation like that where these guys who are sort of like moving on past this like musical project that they had spent like years on and a lot of money and a lot of time, and you get to tell them like you hit the ultimate goal for you, which is like a sellout at this, you know, historically relevant sort of Niagara venue. And that was like watching the show after that came with a whole other different, you know, a whole different feeling, because you're like, these guys know they did it. So that's a more like positive story. I mean, there's plenty of like goofy, funny other ones if you want to hear a weird.
Yeah, throw me a goofy one.
This is one of those like the Wiggles situations.
Okay.
But there was a show, a good turned out to be a really good show. Like the show itself did well. People had a good time. There was a show back a few years ago at Warehouse. Mm-hmm. A rock band, who sort of like had the very like rock bandy attitude.
Okay.
You know?
The damn Wiggles.
The party time, the party band, you know, like the party rock band that likes to have a good time, talks about drinking on stage. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
The call outs to the crowd about like,
who's getting fucked up tonight?
One of those, right? And then they get fucked up. I don't know. But it's mostly just a show. But anyway, so like those types of bands are like kind of sometimes can be like a lot to deal with, because you're like, in a sense, they're like encouraging the crowd to be less like obedient towards just like normal social cues and the rules of like, can you not wreck this place? Like, please don't throw your bottles in the air. Like, please don't, you know, like, let's keep the mosh pit sort of like reasonable.
Right.
You know, sometimes people go a little bananas. But anyway, the end of the show comes around, and my job, after sort of the dust settles of like people kind of buy their merch and they head out, and the lights kind of come on and people are, you know, you're more or less just like tidying, and my job is like waiting for the sort of the band to pack up so that we can like settle the show and they can move on to, you know, whether it's to the hotel or to the next city or whatever they're doing. And this was a unusually long sort of like pack up, because the show was like, it was a Friday night, like they were having a good time. Band was drinking, like they had a few people hanging around who were drinking, and sort of, you know, you don't like, there's no reason to like crush that people are having a good time. Like you can hang out and deal with that. But when it came time to actually like sort of settle the show, and pay the band and like, you know, thank them for being there, it was like the singer was gone. Like he was missing. The singer of the band was missing. So the rest of the band is like, we don't know where he is, like, but like someone else will settle, and that was fine. Then it came to like actually loading out, and this is like, you know, the show ends at like 11:30. The band is like there till 12:30 drinking and hanging out and whatever, and then it's time to start like packing up the van, and they can't find the keys for the van, so they can't get in the van to load out. And it's like, I think it was like winter, it was not summer. It was like, I remember them not like, the idea of just putting the gear outside was not like an option,
right?
And they couldn't get a hold of the singer of the band, and it turned out that the singer of the band had made friends with a person at the show who he had decided to go off with her to who knows where.
Sure.
You know, I guess. And couldn't get a hold of him. And so time is like, the clock is ticking. I'm like, I sent staff home, right? The venue has been cleaned. Like, it's just the band, their gear, an empty room, and me. Right?
Yeah.
Everything is packed, and it's all just in the building. And I'm like waiting for this, and I'm like, what's going on. Like, I kind of just casually hung out, but as it turns out, the singer of the band finally shows up maybe an hour and a half after the band's like more or less packed up.
Okay.
And he's, I had nothing to say to him because the band was already furious enough with this guy.
On your behalf.
And they're on because
Yeah.
they want to move on too.
Yeah, yeah.
And it turns out that they're like, okay, we need the keys because we need to get in the van. He's like, I don't have the keys. And I'm watching this sort of like from a distance where like I know what's going on. Like I know, like they don't know I'm really paying attention, but
Sure.
and he's like, I don't have the keys. And they're like, well, where are the keys? He's like, well, they were in my bag. And they're like, is it in the green room? No, it's not in the green room. Turns out that the guys like put the keys for the van in his backpack and then locked his backpack in the van. So now it's 2 a.m. Everyone's like no longer buzzed at all. They are not having a good time. They need to move on. They need to drive to. They had to drive somewhere. Like
They're on a tour.
They were like driving to somewhere, be like Kingston or something. Like,
yeah.
It was not going to be like a fun overnight drive, but they had to do it. And so they had to like, and this was a point where I was like, listen guys, like I gotta go. Like I can't hang out any longer. I think I had something going on in the next day,
sure.
super early in the morning. It was like, the story, I remember hearing the rest of the story secondhand that they actually like had to call, they tried to call CAA, but it was going to be like 2 hours. So they ended up just smashing the window of their own van.
Really?
To get into their van, to then get the keys to start the van, to be able to load the van with all their gear and merch, and then leave. And they didn't get out of like the parking lot at Warehouse until like sometime around like 3 or 4 in the morning.
Wow.
After a show that ended at 11, and like in part, it was only made worse by the fact that the singer like went home with someone, you know, after the show, and like didn't tell anyone where he was going, so they had no opportunity to sort of like get ahead of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the Wiggles, crazy group of guys. Anyway, so that's a pretty funny example. People do hilarious stuff, alcohol infused party nights after a show can like go sideways pretty quick.
Yeah.
I mean, like generally speaking, most bands are, and like the funny thing is, even those guys, like I wanted to kill them, like in halfway through that situation. But at the end of the day, like, they weren't doing anything malicious. They like were having a good time, and one of them fucked up.
Yeah.
And they ended up having to smash their own window, which probably made the $500 or $600 or whatever that they were getting paid to play the show, like.
The drive home would have been,
and a winter drive with a smashed window in your
wouldn't
van.
have wanted to been in that vehicle.
No, yeah, you guys have probably toured in enough shitty vehicles.
Yeah,
but at least you probably had the windows up in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a couple stories like that, but that one stuck out for me because I just remember like walking away, and like I'd never had to do that. I don't think I've ever left the venue before the band. You know what I mean? I mean, sure, I've not been at every single show, but I've probably never had to say, okay, guys, I'll see you later, and no one else is also there. Like, I locked the door, left them outside in the parking lot, and was like, good luck. So
that's wild.
I guess that's a bandictote that coming from someone not in a band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got another one?
I mean, probably, man. There's so many like funny stories that aren't necessarily like. We've done so many funny shows.
Yeah.
Kenny versus Spenny.
Yeah. I was at the one that was like one of the last it wasn't the last gig at Warehouse, but it was
Kenny
one
versus
of
Spenny
the
was
last.
the last.
It was?
There was a 2-show
Yeah.
one night event. The day, it was the 13th of March. It was the last the last event, which is kind of, this is even funnier.
Yeah.
Like the last event we would do before like 6.5 months of not being open again was that. But we did one of those. We did that one then. We did another one before that in 2018.
Mm-hmm. I think it was at that one too.
And that was the show. Were you at that one too? The original, the first one we
did?
Where like the end of the show finished with like somebody being given a prostate exam.
Yep.
On stage. And like the best part about that is that I knew it was happening. Like I knew it was going to happen because they told you. They told me like, here's the show. Like we make fun of each other for 90 minutes and then Spenny gives someone a prostate exam.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 19 plus, so whatever. Everyone's consenting. But the best part is that the guy who volunteered, and this is what comes with with those sort of not music like stage, like not comedy, but it's, you know what I mean? Like
Some
there's
sort
these,
of
like,
live entertainment that's not music.
It's not really a comedy show because it's not like a set and there's not really jokes.
It's not stand up.
And it's not stand up and it's not music. It's like just sort of like there's a unique thing that happens in Canada. I think it's a uniquely Canadian thing that like actors who've played characters on television shows go on after the show is over, like making money playing that character in
That's right.
in other contexts.
Yeah.
Like Trailer Park Boys, Letterkenny. I mean, Kenny and Spenny are actually people, and they are those people. But like, there is obviously an amped up version of what they're like on TV.
Yeah.
But anyway, so shows like that, there's always like some sort of bring the person on stage element, and like, you know, something funny happens. And you know, in some cases it's like we did one with Taggart and Torrens, who do it's like Jonathan Torrens, who's Jonovision.
That's right.
Trailer Park Boys.
I was gonna say I know the name. I just think.
And then Jeremy Taggart is the drummer of Our Lady Peace, and they have a podcast.
Really?
They have a podcast together, and they would do like they've done a few like live podcast tours, and you know they'll like bring people up and like, or they'll like do Q&As, and it's like sort of crowd involvement and
right.
There's like stuff like that. Randy's Cheeseburger Picnic was another event we did with Randy from the Trailer Park Boys. That's you know, there's like they pulled people up on stage to see who had the best. It was like who had the best beer belly or something.
Yeah.
like who had that. So they got a bunch of people on stage who are like, and everyone's cheering for who has the best. Anyway, so when we did the Kenny versus Spenny one the first time around, and I knew this thing was coming. My favorite part about it is that like they ask someone, they say who wants to have their prostate examined on stage, and like, you know, people are drinking and they're having a good time and they put their hands up. They're like, because they think it's like a joke, it's like a novelty, like,
right?
Oh, I'll be the guy that goes on stage, like it's not really gonna happen.
Yeah.
And this guy goes up on stage, you know, like his friends are like cheering him on. He was so excited.
He was very excited.
And then he found out that it was actually happening.
Yeah.
And he was suddenly, I think the first person actually went up and was like, "Oh no, I don't actually want to do this." And they're like, "Okay, get off."
Yeah, that's,
you know, who actually wants to do this? But this guy didn't think it was really gonna happen. Like he didn't think, and then the rubber gloves came out.
Yeah. And
it was like the idea that it was like this educational exercise to say like, this is not, there's like, his whole thing was like, there's nothing weird about this. Like this is something you should do.
This is something that you should do often.
A preventative measure and for a good reason. Anyway, and like this guy goes up on stage and like it happened. And I can honestly say like I never would have thought we could do shows, I could do events for another 20 years. I don't think that is ever going to happen again. So again, not really a band thing, but that's wild. That's a pretty wild story.
Yeah,
that hey, were you at that show where someone got a live prostate exam on stage?
Was a human puppet for someone.
It was a weird one. So yeah.
Anyway. When you're now, I normally ask bands who tour do this, but I'm just curious. When you're on the road, what's your gas station snack? Taquitos, yeah. Those are so sick.
I could be on the road. I mean, you know what? The funny part is like when I think about being on the road, I'm obviously not in a band. So like when I think about driving somewhere far away,
yeah,
it's like you're really just going to like an en route, probably.
Yeah,
you know, or like a gas station.
Yep.
If you're not in Ontario, you're at just like a gas station service center somewhere, and like they don't have 7-Elevens, so like that's not even a good answer. Taquitos, like specifically, like if I know if I'm going to 7-Eleven, that's a snack.
Yeah.
But, Tim Hortons Honey Cruller.
There you go.
For sure.
Tim Hortons everywhere.
They're everywhere, right? And no matter where you are in the country, even like a big chunk of on the other side of the border, you can find a Tim Hortons.
Yeah.
And the Honey Cruller is like to me, it's like the perfect donut.
Mm-hmm.
It's not heavy. It's super light. It feels like you didn't eat anything. Yeah. But you definitely get that sugar rush.
Yeah.
And, you know, just a simple, like, icing sugar.
Nice.
Best 90 cents you could spend on the
road,
you go. I think.
Yeah. Now, again, I ask most bands this, but I'm going to turn this question a little around. I normally ask bands what would be their rock star rider. What's their dream rider? What's the weirdest rider you've had to deal with? We don't have to mention names, but what's the weirdest rider you've had to deal with working with bands?
It's a good question to ask people that are in bands. It's a good question to ask people who run shows, because they see them, and I've seen hundreds of them. Like I've seen hundreds of riders. And I will say that like riders are most often like a wish list. They're not necessarily like people think of them as like this is a list of demands, and if they aren't met, like the band's not playing.
Right.
It's very rarely that's ever even close to the case. It's usually like, if possible, we would love these things.
Yeah.
But it's totally cool if like you can't find that. But the nice example, or the best example I could give you, is actually easy to tell who it is because they wouldn't mind, because it's hilarious. It's not a crazy request in terms of like being demanding or over the top, but it is like, it's a good story. Back when when Brock did like Frost Week and Frost Week sort of concerts, like the first week of January back, they did a concert with Colorado in the September of whatever year it was, and it was at Isaac's on campus, and the student union like at the university like did events every year, but they it was always like student staff, and like not a lot of them had like done it for very long. It's like they were new to the whole idea, and so they booked Colorado to play like a volunteer appreciation show at Isaac's for all the people who helped with the Frost Week events. And Colorado's rider at the time had and I'm pretty sure this is right. I hope it's not the wrong I don't want to get the specifics wrong, but if I remember correctly, it was one golden retriever. Just like to be available, at the band's discretion. And so, obviously this is a joke, right? It's like those guys are funny guys. They're everything about their sort of how the band was presented, to the people organizing shows was always a little funny. Like their like stage plot, so to speak, which is like what a venue and the sound person gets to sort of, oh, hey, the drummer needs a mic and this goes here and that goes there. That was literally like hand drawn on a piece of paper and then I scanned as a PDF, and it was like the worst drawing I'd ever seen. But I mean, in reality, was that like that's all you needed, right? You just needed like drummer here, guitar, bass, like here's where the mics go. It's not necessarily complicated, but theirs was intentionally poorly drawn. Like I think intentionally, it was like looked like it was drawn on a napkin.
Yeah.
And then they scanned it. Anyway, so that's the kind of guys that they were, as far as like they wanted venues to be like, let's not take this whole thing too seriously.
Right.
And so on their rider were like a handful of normal things, like bottles of water and like chips and hummus and, sandwich things to make sandwiches, like whatever, like all the normal stuff a band would have. But at the bottom of the list was like a golden retriever. And in their sort of like, I remember hearing this story from someone who had been on staff at the time, that like they kind of were like, what are we gonna do? Like, and one of the staff, student staff at the student union at the time had a golden retriever. So they brought their golden retriever on the day of the show, like before the show, like all this stuff is usually like upon load in, these things available to the band in the green room. And so they brought their golden retriever to Isaac's to like give to the like, hey, here's the dog. And the band lost their minds.
Yeah.
Like, this is the funniest thing that's ever happened. No one has ever actually done this, because of course it's a joke, but like they were in love with it so much that they took the dog for a walk around the university campus, like just because they were like, well, you brought your dog, let's take the dog for a walk. And then they returned the dog to like the owner, and they took their dog home.
That's amazing.
But yeah, funniest rider item, golden retriever.
Yeah.
For sure. And the funniest story about it is someone actually did it. I mean, I've seen all kinds of like hilarious specific stuff, like like the joke, what's the joke, or like the stereotype is like certain colored M&Ms or something like that.
Yes.
I have seen that on riders as a joke, because there's such like folklore around it, right? It was like, I don't know what band it was, like Motley Crue or the Beatles.
Timmer told me this.
Was that what it was?
Yeah.
That like there was and a thing that's, I'd say like a thing that's worth mentioning about riders is that like a lot of the time that like super specific stuff is only there to make sure that whoever's running the show is like paying attention.
That's just
right?
it.
It's not because the band is actually like only gonna play if they get red M&Ms. It's like so that they can go like, well, there's the red M&Ms, so we know that this guy or this girl was like
paying attention.
So there are those examples, and I think that just comes with like the 70s and the 80s and maybe the 90s with like Guns N' Roses and like the biggest bands at that time, that there was like rider requests were absolutely crazy. That like they'd have drugs on them, or like on the rider, like this much drugs, like there'd be stuff like that. And then these promoters would be like, how do we secure drugs for this band? But
Have you had to get drugs? Has that been on a rider?
I've never seen it on a rider. I have definitely been asked for assistance in
Right.
procuring certain items.
I think I've helped
on
you
the
in
day
that.
of the show. I mean, it's also like weirdly before this was not as weird a thing, or before it was a normal, I mean, I guess it was always like, to me it seemed like it was never that illegal.
Right.
So being asked to help someone find pot was never that crazy.
Yeah.
But prior to legalization, it was always such a like hush hush thing, especially because a lot of the time you're talking about bands that have like come in from out of the country.
Yeah.
Or out of province or whatever, and like traveling with it was like wouldn't have been wise, so they kind of get to a place and then, but yeah, I've never seen it on a list, although I've heard rumors that it was on a rider in a quite substantial way for Cypress Hill.
Oh yeah.
When they played it back at the whatever it was called
Barracuda?
at the time, Barracuda Pretty at the time.
Yeah.
That there was a pretty sizable request on their rider.
Wow.
Which I don't know, probably would have been relatively easy for them to
I'm sure.
fulfill.
I'm sure.
So, yeah.
That's crazy.
Riders are like a fun quirk of the job of putting on shows, and like 99% of the time they're very boring,
Yeah.
right? Like bands even now know how much like goofiness surrounds rider requests, and so they even kind of like go out of their way to stress like, we don't really need that much.
Yeah.
Like we'll take like a couple beers and like some water for the stage and like some
A veggie
chips
tray.
and like something. Yeah, veggie tray. I probably have like supported the Zares like fresh vegetable counter personally, just in veggie trays and fruit trays over the years. And I always think like what people think when I'm at the grocery store, like buying this same allotment of things. Not that they've seen me multiple times, but like, what would you like? Who is this person buying like 48 bottles of water, like all the hummus and pita chips, a veggie tray, a fruit tray, like 9-volt batteries, and like various other like granola bars and snacks, things that you can like. It's like riders are like never stuff you actually eat that day, or they
Right.
are. But like a lot of the stuff on a rider is like for the road.
They just take
right?
it.
It's like saying like, can we get like a box of like Nature Valley granola bars, right? Like whatever. And it's not because they're eating them at the show. It's so that like while they're driving from here to London, they've got something to snack on. So I don't know. Maybe that takes a little bit of the fun out of the whole rider thing. I think it's a way more fun question to be like, what would be on your rider?
Yeah.
So I'm sure we got to check out what some of those other folks said about that.
Yeah. So I got one more question for you. It's a big one, but you should be able to answer it. What are your top 5 favorite bands of all time? If you can't give me 5, give me 3.
I could give you 10, but I'll do my best to give you 5. In order, or just in
It doesn't
general?
need to be in any
Okay,
order.
Good. Okay, so it doesn't have to be in order. Thursday,
I knew you were going to say that.
Poison the Well, Constantine's. That's my top 3. For sure. And then it's like a huge, like massive toss up between a whole bunch of other bands. So, I feel like I want to just like, that definitely doesn't represent my whole music taste, but it's like, that's like, if I think about bands I've listened to for like a super, super long time.
And the ones you go back to constantly.
I mean, like, bands like Manchester Orchestra, I think I've listened to since like high school.
They're a cool band.
Same with like Minus the Bear, and there's like bands that are like my go-tos, and like I try to treat like buying vinyl like this. Like I'm not a huge, for the amount of opportunity I've had to buy vinyl over the years at shows and stuff, like I have a pretty modest collection of music that way, but I've always tried to like only buy these records if they're like my all-time favorite albums from my favorite bands, because it's easy to get kind of caught up in that.
Yeah, and it just can grow.
And it just gets out of control.
Yeah.
So, those are my top 3. I feel like everything after that is like too evenly, matched.
Yeah.
But like my music taste has been forced to become like extremely broad, which is why, it's hard to choose. Like I come back to albums now that I listen to 10 years ago, and I'm like, shit, this is awesome. Then I get kind of sucked into it for like where I just like kill it for a week. I only listen to that one record or that one band for a while. So it's constantly evolving. But yeah, those are like, maybe if anyone that knows me, those are definitely like easy.
Those are the
Probably
three.
easy top picks. Like Thursday, I have a Thursday tattoo. We'll acknowledge this on the internet. Most people already know. So that one's a dead giveaway. I've had that since I was like 16. So no going back. Poison the Well, I saw for the first time with Thursday, and like I've always thought were like the most mind blowing, like heavy band to exist, and no one ever came close to sort of like sounding like that in all the years they existed. And no matter how many bands said Poison the Well like influenced us, or we love Poison the Well, I've never heard a single other band really like sound like that. And then the Constantines are like my go-to like Canadian, like the all-time best Canadian band. And everything after that's like a giant tie.
There you go. Well, right on. Well, thank you for so much for doing this with me.
Thanks for having me.
So if you want to plug the social medias or give a shout outs to anything, now would be your time.
Okay, shout out to Timmer.
You could?
For beating me to being on this podcast. And also, well, how long ago was it? 6 months ago?
It was a while ago, and he wasn't in person. He never got to do the video.
Well, he'll come down and do it. You should have him on talk in person because he's way funnier in person. No, like the venues on the internet, Warehouse, just you can find it, Warehouse Concert Hall. And Indoor Shoes is still there, but follow Warehouse if you're interested in any live music going on in the club venue level in St. Catharines. And then Cicda Music and Arts Festival is also online, and the lineup is coming hopefully in the next like month for this year's festival. So those are the two big things.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, we'll end it there.
Cool, man. Thank you.
Awesome.